Hey there, modern world history students. This is the last lesson of Unit 6 on the First World War. It's a continuation of section number 13, focusing on President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. We actually only have to cover the 14th of the 14 points, and then we'll continue on to section 14 and talk about some of the things that President Wilson never intended to have be part of the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war, which made it in nevertheless because of the insistence of the leaders of Britain and France. So in this first part, we'll talk about the League of Nations and how it became incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles. So we're now on page 20 in the upper right-hand corner. In the upper left-hand corner, you see that map of Europe that represented Europe in the years following the war. And you can see some of those new countries that were created or old countries that were reborn as a result of the war. New countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and old countries reborn like Poland. That was all part of Woodrow Wilson's effort to eliminate the problem of nationalism, which had been one of the contributors to the outbreak of the war. And you might remember that in general, that was Woodrow Wilson's goal with the 14 points. To identify the factors that in his mind had caused the war and to take steps to eliminate them. So granting self-determination, that is, the right to govern themselves in their own independent states, was meant to be a way to reduce the problem of nationalism. But Woodrow Wilson's 14th point, which we're going to cover in the upper right-hand corner here, was for him the most important of them all. He wanted to create an organization that he called the League of Nations. And he felt that this was the cornerstone of his entire 14 points plan. He intended this as being the centerpiece, the part that would play the largest role in preventing future wars. So the idea of a League of Nations was that you could have an organization where every country was represented. Every one of the world's countries could be represented in this organization, and it would provide a forum where countries that were in conflict with each other could settle their differences through negotiation rather than through violence, rather than through resort to war. And that if countries had this forum, which they didn't have prior to World War I, you could prevent future wars, because rather than fighting it out when they were in conflict with each other, these countries could negotiate. And they could negotiate with the other countries functioning as sort of objective third parties to mediate them and help them settle their differences. And so that was one function of the League of Nations, as Woodrow Wilson sort of conceived it going into the Paris Peace Conference. The other function was a little bit more forceful. Wilson also conceived of the League of Nations as a kind of super alliance. That is to say that the League of Nations charter would require that if any member of the League was attacked, or invaded, regardless of who invaded them, whether the invading country was a member of the League or not, if any member of the League was attacked, then all the other members of the League were obligated to assist them in defeating the attack. And I don't know that Woodrow Wilson ever referred to this as a super alliance, but that's kind of the way I think of it. An alliance essentially of all the world's countries, not against another country, but against the concept of invading another country. They were pledged to help each other resist invasion so that no country would even think of invading another country. Think about it. If you knew that invading another country would mean not only fighting them, but fighting essentially the rest of the world, that it would be you against the world, you probably wouldn't do it. And that was the idea of the League of Nations in its function as a sort of super alliance. Woodrow Wilson imagined that the League of Nations would serve as a deterrent. It would prevent countries invading other countries, because no one would want to invade another country if they knew it meant that they would have to fight the whole world. So that was two different ways that the League of Nations was meant to prevent future wars. Number one by providing a forum where countries could negotiate their differences, their conflicts, rather than fighting. And then number two, with the super alliance, to deter or prevent countries from invading other countries, because they would know they'd be fighting the whole league. And this is why Wilson was willing to give up so many of his other points, of the 14 points. This is why when the British and French said no to the points 1 through 6 and wanted to compromise on the creating of these new states, Wilson was agreeable to it. It's why Wilson was willing to go along with that, because he felt that if he could get their support for the League of Nations, then the League could handle a lot of the work of preventing future wars. So all of Wilson's 14 points were meant to address problems that had contributed to the First World War in order to prevent future wars. But he felt that getting British and French support for this, the League of Nations, was the most important piece of all. And it worked. By giving up all the other things, he did get British and French support for the League of Nations. And when the Treaty of Versailles, remember, this is the Paris Peace Conference. This particular part of it, the part dealing with Germany, was held at the Palace of Versailles just outside Paris. So when the Treaty of Versailles was finished and formalized, it included the Charter of the League of Nations. So Wilson did what he set out to do. By giving up on some of his other points, he did get British and French support for creating the League of Nations. Now, what's really ironic about this, then, is that having gained the support of the British and French, it was the United States who actually never joined the League. Remember, maybe you learned about this in 8th grade when you studied the U.S. Constitution. The President of the United States, or representatives sent by the President of the United States, negotiates treaties. But before the United States becomes an actual party to any treaty, the treaty has to be approved, ratified, by a 2/3 vote of the U.S. Senate. Well, when President Wilson brought the Treaty of Versailles back to the United States, having negotiated it personally in Paris, he presented it to the U.S. Senate for approval, ratification. But immediately, many U.S. senators objected to it. And the part that they objected to primarily was the League of Nations. They didn't like the idea that being a member of the League of Nations would commit the United States to fighting wars that we might not have any interest in fighting. So a senator who was opposed to the treaty and to the League of Nations might say, look, according to this League of Nations charter, if Romania invades Bulgaria, the United States is obligated to send soldiers to assist Bulgaria. And what interest does the United States have in deploying our soldiers to southeastern Europe to defend Bulgaria against an invasion by Romania? Many American senators said, that doesn't make sense. And of course, it didn't help that the First World War had been so horrible, so catastrophic, so devastating. Even the United States, which had only really effectively been in the war for 6 months, had suffered 100,000 Americans killed, 200,000 injured. And so many, many U.S. senators did not approve of the Treaty of Versailles because of the League of Nations. They didn't want the United States committed to fighting wars that we had no particular interest in fighting. And so in the end, despite all of President Wilson's efforts, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. In 1920, a very simple treaty was drawn up between the United States and Germany stating that we were no longer at war. And that was that. And that was ratified by the Senate. So the United States never became a member of the League of Nations, the league which Wilson had envisioned, the league that he had fought so hard to get approved by the European allies, the league for which he had given up so many of the other parts of his 14 points, came into existence, but the United States was never a member of it. And that proved in the long run to be a great weakness of the League. There was something else that Woodrow Wilson had to do that he didn't really want to do in order to get the Treaty of Versailles completed and in order to get British and French support for the League of Nations. And that is the topic of Section 14, the punishment of Germany. Remember that Woodrow Wilson had come into the Paris Peace Conference with the view that no individual country or even group of countries had been responsible for World War One, but rather that it had been caused by a malfunctioning system of international relations, that the way that countries related to each other was messed up. And because of that, in his view, no country, since no country had caused the war, no country should be punished for the war. Well, on the other hand, the leaders of Britain, David Lloyd George, and of France, Georges Clemenceau, they saw things very differently. From their view, Germany had caused the war, and they fully intended to punish and disarm Germany and take land away from Germany. And so, in the end, in order for Woodrow Wilson to get their support for his League of Nations, he also had to agree to the punishment of Germany. So, the point of Section 14 is this. I hope that you're able to explain why and how Germany was punished by certain terms included in the Treaty of Versailles, including the War Guilt Clause, reparations, and disarmament. And we'll talk about how the British naval blockade was used to enforce all of this and to require the Germans to sign this treaty, even though they objected to it because of the way that it punished them. So this is our last sort of point, and we're at the bottom of page 20. So as I mentioned, the other Allied powers, Britain and France, were determined that Germany should be punished. In their view, Germany bore the primary responsibility for causing the war. They pointed, for example, to Germany's agreement to support Austria-Hungary in the event that Austria-Hungary went to war with Serbia and Russia, the so-called blank check that Kaiser Wilhelm II had given to Austria-Hungary's leader, Franz Josef. If Germany had simply told Austria-Hungary, no, we won't support you, Austria-Hungary might have had to back down and decrease their demands on Serbia. They also pointed out that at a point when Germany was really only at war with Serbia and Russia, Germany chose to implement the Schlieffen Plan, going to war with France also, which was not at that point in the war. And they pointed out that Germany had invaded Belgium. So for those reasons, the Allied powers felt like Germany was to blame for the war. And so they intended to punish Germany. So one of the important terms of the Treaty of Versailles was called the War Guilt Clause. So I'm sorry, the word war is partially covered up by my little window here. The War Guilt Clause. And the War Guilt Clause is simply a part of the Treaty of Versailles which states that Germany must accept the blame. Germany must accept the responsibility for the war. This is something that really outraged Germans. The Germans would argue, for example, that the war, after all, had started when a Bosnian Serb nationalist terrorist group had assassinated the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. That act did not involve Germany. And then Russia had jumped in to support Serbia. That didn't involve Germany. And after all, it was Austria-Hungary who had made the demands on Serbia after the assassination, and that had not involved Germany. And so the Germans, from their viewpoint, had a reason to believe that they were not solely to blame for the war. And yet it seemed like in the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to take full responsibility. Well, the War Guilt Clause, then, because it forced Germany to take responsibility for the war, it then became the legal basis for punishing Germany. Well, how would they be punished? Well, for one thing, Germany would be forced to pay what are called reparations. Reparations. What are reparations? Well, that is a payment for the damage that was caused. Since the Allied powers blamed Germany for the war, they now were going to require Germany to pay for the damage suffered by the civilians of the Allied powers as a result of the war. So civilians who suffered damages in Belgium, in France, in Britain. Think about all of the British or French cargo ships that have been sunk by German submarines. Those are owned by private companies. In France, farms and towns that were devastated. In Belgium, towns that were flattened during the German invasion. All of that was damage that Germany was now required to pay for because they were being forced to accept the blame for the war. The total amount of money. Now, the Allied powers were not expecting Germany to pay it back immediately. They created a schedule that was 30 years long for the Germans to make these payments, but then they did charge the Germans interest. And so by the time you counted up the actual reparations plus the interest, we're talking about $55 billion. That's billion with a B. Germany was required to pay $55 billion in reparations in order to cover the damages suffered by British, French, Belgian, American civilians during the war. Many historians believe that $55 billion was greater than the total amount of wealth in Germany combined. And that's why this political cartoon from the New York World has Germany sort of buried under this pile of reparations payments they're expected to make. And it says, let's see you collect it. Because it was seen that Germany could never make this payment. So that was one way that Germany was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles and punished. Germany was also disarmed. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles were designed to disarm Germany. So, for example, Germany's army was reduced to 100,000 men. Germany was not allowed to have an army larger than 100,000 men. And they were not allowed to have a draft. That is to conscript people, to force people into their army. They were not allowed to have a navy really to speak of. And what you see here is a German warship being deliberately sunk off the coast of Britain. So the German navy was scrapped. Germany was allowed to have a navy that would be more like a coast guard, small ships to protect the coasts and the rivers, and that was it. That was as large as the German navy was allowed to be. They could have no large ocean-going warships and no submarines at all. Germany was not allowed to have an air force. So in addition to forcing Germany to accept blame for the war and forcing them to pay reparations, the Treaty of Versailles disarmed Germany as well. And it took land away from Germany. Germany lost all of their overseas colonies. Now, Germany, because of Bismarck's restraint, did not have a lot of overseas colonies. But the small numbers of colonies that the Germans did have were taken away. So colonies that were islands in the Pacific were handed over to the Japanese. They became part of the Japanese Empire. Colonies that Germany had in Africa following the Berlin Conference were handed over to other countries, to Britain mostly. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just Germany's overseas empire that they lost as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. But don't forget also Alsace-Lorraine, this territory here, which was, roughly half French, half German, but which had been part of Germany since 1871. That was now stripped away from Germany. But it wasn't just that was land, but it was some of the most valuable land in terms of resources, coal and iron ore, which were now lost to Germany. The other major resource and land that was lost to Germany was here. You can see that when the Allied powers created the new state of Poland, the new country of Poland after the war, what they had chosen to do was to give it access to the ocean, because no country could expect to have a modern economy if they did not have access to the water so that they could trade. As a matter of fact, that had been a major reason why Poland had ceased to exist in the first place. It had been weakened by its inability to trade. So now, when Poland was recreated, what they did is they detached a portion of Germany. It used to be Germany stretched right across here. And notice that a part of Germany, East Prussia, remained part of Germany, but it was detached from the rest of Germany because this little neck of Germany was taken away and given to Poland so that Poland would have access to the ocean so that it could trade. This was called the Danzig Corridor, sometimes called the Polish Corridor, and it gave Poland access to the port of Danzig. That's what the Germans called it. The Poles call it Gdansk. It's the same port. Danzig in German, Gdansk in Polish. That had been Germany's busiest port prior to the war, and now it wasn't even part of Germany anymore. It was now given essentially, effectively, to Poland. So Germany lost valuable resources, valuable coal and iron ore in Alsace-Lorraine, access to its busiest port in Danzig. So the treaty was very hard on Germany. It did not, as you probably know, completely crush the Germans. It did not create a Germany that was totally helpless, but it did humiliate the Germans by blaming them for the war, forcing them to pay for the war's damages, taking away their global empire, taking away other valuable lands, and disarming them. Many people would point to the way that the Treaty of Versailles treated the Germans as a major contributor then to the Second World War and to the rise of Adolf Hitler. But the rise of Hitler is a topic for our next unit, and the Second World War is a topic for the unit after that. For now, we're done with the First World War. We're done with Unit 6. So, take care of yourselves, be healthy, and be safe. I'll look forward to teaching you those next units. Goodbye, Model World History students.